Doctor José, no sé si empieza usted ya.
Gracias, Carolina. Good morning to some, good afternoon to others. I am José Antonio Moreno Rodriguez, and as president of CEDEP, I welcome you to this webinar on the CISG Advisory Council Opinion number 20, organized by CEDEP and ASADIP with the support of UNCITRAL, commemorating the 40th anniversary of the Vienna Sales Convention. Also, ICC Paraguay and the Mood Alumni Association joined their support for this event. In 2020, CEDEP is celebrating 20 years of fruitful existence, a history full of academic projects with leading universities such as Georgetown, Bologna, Heidelberg, Di Tella, Chile, Buenos Aires, etc. CEDEP is also an observer organization of UNCITRAL and has close academic links with UNIDROIT, the Hague Conference on Private International Law, the Organization of American States, and many others. CEDEP hosts the Paraguayan chapters of the International Academy of Comparative Law, the International Chamber of Commerce, and the Administrative Secretariat of ASADIP, with which it proudly co-organizes this event. Throughout its existence, CEDEP organized several courses, seminars, workshops, and major events. CEDEP teams also conducted relevant research projects, and moreover, CEDEP published in Paraguay several books with outstanding contributions of academics worldwide. Many of the leading global and regional jurists participated in our activities during the last 20 years, and today is no exception. A living legend on international sales law, dear Professor Ingeborg Schwenzer, joins us again today after visiting Asunción for a week last year, exactly one year ago, in which precisely the CISG Advisory Council, once presided by her, made significant progress regarding its now opinion number 20. Professor Schwenzer is the author of the leading book on the CISG of our times and lectures on the subject worldwide. Not less an honor is that one of the most remarkable legal officers in UNCITRAL's history, Mr. Angelo Stella Faria, will pronounce some introductory words this session on behalf of the organization. It is the second time that Mr. Stella Faria participates in an event organized by CEDEP. He did so some time ago as Secretary General of UNIDROIT, attracting hundreds of participants in Asunción. We are very thankful also to Luca Castellani, who's also hearing us today, and he was very supportive of our event last year. Also, Luca, an outstanding legal officer of UNCITRAL. Well, and last but not least, we are joined today by Professor Paula Al, President of the prestigious American Association of Private International Law, ASADIP, and a close friend of CEDEP, who will also make some introductory remarks on behalf of this organization. Thank you very much, Ingeborg, Angelo, and Paula. And Professor Paula Al, you have the floor.
Thanks, Jose. It's a great honor for me to join you on behalf of American Association of Private International Law, ASADIP, accompanying the Center of Study of Law, Economics and Politics, CEDEP, and Professor Jose Moreno on such an important day. And everyone surely knows ASADIP was founded in 2007 in Asunción and has more than 400 members for all over the continent, as well as from other countries outside the America. ASADIP aims to reaffirm the need to include in private international law as a mandatory chapter in regular course at law school, and to strengthen the teaching is a postgraduate course, to promote study and research, to set a documentation and information center regarding private international law, and to cooperate with the Organization of American States regarding inter-American rules of the subject, as well with other instances on universal, regional, sub-regional national institutions, both public and private, in charge of the drafting and development of private international law, and diffuse to the labor of international organizations in private international law matters. CEDEP has always supported ASADIP in all the activities, and for us, it's a joy to be part of this celebration on first 20 years. All of us who knows Professor Moreno Rodriguez are quite aware of his responsibility and his normal dedication to international commercial law, international arbitration, comparative law, private international law, and commitment that permits the entire CEDEP team. CEDEP is a formidable academic, research, and training team with a global vision, but absolute commit on the reality of Paraguay on the Latin American region. We therefore celebrate his initiative in organizing this important activity. It is an absolute pleasure for us to be able to hear today Professor Ingeborg, an expert on international sales law. As the Professor Moreno said, the living legend on international sales law. From ASADIP, we are very grateful for the presence of Mr. Estrella Faria, who has been present in several ASADIP conferences. ASADIP have relationship with organizations and UNCITRAL, UNIDROIT, the Hub Conference, and the Organization of American States. This year, unfortunately, we have had to suspend our annual conference due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we hope to be able to count with your presence in November 2021 in Washington, DC. The conference will be about private international law and modern technology. We will be very glad to see all you again there. I would like to thank Professor Moreno, Professor Schwensen, and Mr. Estrella Faria for sharing their time with us, presenting a lecture of tremendous importance for our region. Thank you, and I shall now give you the floor, Mr. Estrella Faria.
Thank you very much, Paula. And special thanks to CEDEP and to Jose Antonio Moreno Rodriguez for the kind and invitation that gives me the great privilege to address all the participants in this important promotional event, and also a special honor to speak just before the main speaker today, Ingeborg Schwenser. She's not only a good friend, but as you all know, one of the most renowned scholars, and certainly, as Jose Antonio said, a legend in the interpretation of in application of the CISG, and a co-author of the most reputable commentary on the CISG. And I will stop here because if I will list all of Ingeborg qualities, you'll be still with me tomorrow morning. UNCITRAL, as the organization where the final drafts of the CISG were developed and eventually adopted under the auspices of the United Nations, has obviously a great interest in promoting, not only disseminating information about the CISG, but also promoting the correct interpretation and application of the CISG. Of course, we as an organization are not supposed to pronounce ourselves on the interpretation of the CISG. We leave that in the good hands of scholars like Ingeborg and all those of the domestic judiciary and international arbitral courts. But we have an interest in disseminating information about this application, and I would simply like to point out that in this year in which we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the CISG, we have just approved, and UNCITRAL has just authorized the publication of a legal guide on uniform text on contract law that was produced in cooperation between the three organizations, the Hague Conference of Private International Law, UNIDROIT, and UNCITRAL, explaining the relationship between the various instruments they have produced on applicable law, general contract law, and the CISG in particular. We've also supported the development of regional instruments such as the OIRS guide on the law applicable to contractual obligations. And this is part of our work in disseminating and promoting the application of the CISG. Now, the topic we have today is one of the greatest importance, not only for the CISG generally, because hardship and impediments of performance are one of the critical aspects of the application of the CISG, but obviously in the context of COVID. And what Ingeborg will address today is not only the general topic of hardship on the CISG and how the CISG differs also from other instruments such as the UNIDROIT principles that are more focused on longer term contracts rather than the sales contract covered by the CISG, but also on this, the impact that the current crisis has on existing contracts, especially those that are covered by the CISG. You could not have chosen a more knowledgeable and capable person for addressing this topic today, Jose Antonio. I thank you again for having us as a co-sponsor of this event. And I look forward to listening to Ingeborg and learning as always I do when I listen to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Angelo, for your very kind words and also for Ancestral support for this very relevant event of an important international reach. And just thank you. Thank you really for always supporting relevant activities conducted in the region by several organizations, among them ASADIP and CEDEP. Okay, Professor Schwenzer, you now have the floor.
Good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen around the world, in the Americas and in Europe. Let me first thank CEDEP and Professor José Moreno Rodriguez for organizing this fantastic event, and also thank Professor Paula Al, José Angelo Estrella Faria for their very kind introductory words. I will talk about force majeure and hardship under the CISG and other international instruments today. I think it is one of the topics that are mostly discussed during these days and that will occupy us in litigation and in arbitration for the years to come due to COVID-19. Let me first give you an overview. Now, wait a second. It does not really work. My presentation. Yes. Yes, I will give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about. After a short introduction, I will introduce you to some domestic approaches and then some international approaches, and we will discuss the general prerequisites for force majeure and hardship under the international instruments. And then I will especially turn to hardship. And after discussing the prerequisites, I will turn what I think is the most important point to the consequences of hardship, the duty to renegotiate, foundation for it. Then we will discuss whether it's necessary and desirable. And then I will discuss with you some factual situations, examples, how hardship works in practice. And then we will turn to the remedy of adaptation by court or tribunal, again, a possible foundation for such a remedy. And then we will also discuss whether it's necessary and desirable. And then the last of the common remedies, termination by court or tribunal. And then if we have discussed, after having discussed these specific remedies for hardships, we will turn to other possible remedies, and finally I will conclude. So let's start with the introduction. Right now, we experience by COVID-19 what is the background for force majeure and hardship, unforeseeable change of circumstances. And this is not only in times of COVID-19, a major problem in international trade, but in generally. it was also a major problem during the financial crisis we had 12 years ago. So during COVID-19 times, we have lockdowns all around the globe, lockdowns of factories. We have experienced breakdown of supply chains, incredible price increases in certain markets, global markets, or increase in transportation costs that made delivery of goods much more onerous than in times before. So what is the starting point? The starting point is, as we all know, the principle pacta sunt servanda, supervening circumstances do not relieve a party from performing the contract. But already in Roman times, there has been an exception to this principle, and that was the exception of impossibilium nulla est obligatio. That means where there is impossibility, there is no obligation. This was the starting point, the impossibility doctrine under Roman law that made its way into civil law legal systems. Adding to the impossibility doctrine, already during the Middle Ages under canon law, there was the clausula rebus sextantibus that allowed for an adaptation of a contract when performance was not impossible, but had become much more onerous for one of the parties. And if we now look into domestic legal systems, we find in the civil law legal systems, we have as a starting point impossibility as relieving one party from performance of the contract, but we also have hardship, where the performance becomes more onerous. This is especially true for Germany, Italy, Portugal, China, but also the Latin American countries, with the exception, by the way, of Mexico. So in civil law legal systems, we do have the dichotomy of impossibility on the one side and hardship on the other side. French law initially did not recognize hardship, which is called imprévision in French. French law only recognized force majeure. It was not until the amendment of the French Civil Code in 2016 that hardship was recognized in private law. Before that, it was already recognized in administrative law, but for private law, we only have it in 2016. The situation is rather different in common law countries. Under English law, even subsequent impossibility was only recognized in the 19th century. And there's no distinction between subsequent impossibility and hardship as we find it in civil law legal system. Rather, we do have the principle of frustration that covers both, but the threshold is much, much higher than we know it from civil law legal systems. In the United States, we do have the recognition of impracticability in the Uniform Commercial Code. It is more generous than English law, but it is still much less generous than we know it from civil law legal systems. So this is or has been the starting point for international developments. We do have recognition of hardship and force majeure, again, the dichotomy that we know from civil law legal systems. In the UNIDROIT principles, as well as in the principles of European contract law and in the draft common frame of reference. They all have been very much influenced actually by civil law legal traditions. We also have the recognition of both force majeure and hardship in the ICC model clauses that have been amended in 2020. We now have, before it was the ICC model clauses of 2003. Now we do have the 2020 ICC model clauses on force majeure on the one hand and on hardship on the other hand. I will come back to these model clauses and we will see how they tackle the problem, especially of hardship. Under the CISG, we do not have this distinction between force majeure and hardship, as we do have it in civil law legal systems and in the international instruments very much influenced by civil law legal systems. Under the CISG, we only have Article 79, and Article 79 does not mention either impossibility nor hardship. Article 79 speaks about impediments, so a rather neutral term, neither impossibility nor hardship. If we look into the drafting history of Article 79, the question whether Article 79 covers hardship was very controversial. And in the end, no decision was taken. Some thought impediment is enough to cover hardship. Others thought no, impediment does not cover hardship. Actually, the modern interpretation, the majority of courts, tribunals, and also literature discussing the hardship question under Article 79, also the CISG Advisory Council, comes to the conclusion that Article 79 does cover hardship situations, not only force majeure or impossibility situations, but also hardship situation. Thus, we do not have to have recourse to any domestic concepts in a case of hardship. There is much controversy about Article 79 and hardship. Some want to rely on the UNIDROIT principles instead and argue that there is a gap under the CISG that has to be filled via Article 7, para 2 and the UNIDROIT principles. I think, or it is also the opinion of the CISG Advisory Council, that we do not have to rely on the UNIDROIT principles, rather that Article 79 itself is able to cover these hardship situations. Actually, rather than discussing the theoretical framework of Article 79, I think it is decisive to distinguish two questions. The two central questions of hardship are: what is the threshold for hardship? And the other question, what I think is must be discussed, and what we discussed extensively in the CISG Advisory Council and in the opinion number 20, what are the consequences of hardship? So let me first turn to the general prerequisites for force majeure and hardship. As I said, if we look at Article 79 CISG, there is no distinction between force majeure and hardship. Rather, both are treated as an impediment. And we have to ask whether a hardship situation where it becomes more onerous for the obligor to perform the contract reaches the level of an impediment to perform the contract. if we look at Article 79, but also at the other international instruments, it is decisive that the impediment or the events that amount to hardship are beyond the control of the obligor. If we look into the COVID-19 situation, this seems to be very clear to me. These events are indeed, or have been indeed, beyond the control of the obligor. The second prerequisite is that they have been unforeseeable. Well, certainly at the outset, COVID-19 has been unforeseeable. And the third prerequisite is that the consequences have been unavoidable. Here also, I would say that the consequences, at least in cases of lockdown of industries and restaurants and the like, these have been unavoidable. One may ask the question in cases where we had breakdown of supply chains, whether it was possible for the obligor to procure the goods from a different source. But in most cases, when, at least at the beginning of COVID-19, when the behavior could not be adapted to this new situation, these circumstances have been unavoidable. What is very important is the time factor. Article 79 CISG, as well as the UNIDROIT principles, cover events after the time of conclusion of the contract, but also events that were already present at the time of the conclusion of the contracts, if the parties did not know about these events, about the impediment. So in COVID-19, it was usually events after the conclusion of the contract. If the contract was concluded during COVID-19, well, the situation was already foreseeable. So we have to distinguish whether the contract was entered into before January, February this year, or after the COVID-19 situation had already taken place. So both provisions, the UNIDROIT principles as well as 79 CISG, cover both impediments that were subsequent to the conclusion of the contract and those that were already present at the time of the conclusion of the contract, but at the time were unknown to both parties. Let us now turn especially to hardship. Hardship is normally defined as a fundamental alteration of the equilibrium of the contract. Be it that the performance of the contract has become too onerous for the obligor, or that the value of the performance by the obligor has decreased for the obligee. It is decisive what is the relevant threshold. When do we come to the conclusion that performance has become too onerous for the obligor, or that the value of the performance has decreased in such a way that we do not hold the obligee anymore to accept performance of the contract? Well, actually, the UNIDROIT principles initially in their 1994 edition suggested a certain percentage as a threshold. And that percentage was in the commentary to the provision on hardship, that percentage was 50%. However, in the next edition, in the commentary, this percentage was deleted because probably a threshold of 50% increase in the costs of performance was on the one hand considered as being too low, and on the other hand, well, having a certain percentage usually does not fit for all cases. In the literature, you find percentages of 100%, and if you look to the to case law, especially during the financial crisis, there have been quite a lot of cases in the steel trade where the market had risen by 70%. There is a very famous case from the Belgian Supreme Court who considered this rise in the market of 70% as hardship. Actually, I myself, as a sole arbitrator, had a similar case, also 70% increase of price in the steel market. And I myself found that 70% are not enough to consider it a case of hardship. There's other case law in Germany, for example, finding that an increase of 300% was not enough to consider it to be a case of hardship. I think there is no one size fits all. We have to consider different factors, and that was also the position of the CISG Advisory Council in our opinion number 20. What factors should be considered to define the threshold for hardship? Well, one factor certainly is whether a transaction has been speculative, or whether we have a market with fluctuating prices, whether we have a long-term or a short-term contract, what is the profit margin for the obligor, and what are the consequences for both parties? Who can pass on the costs, the increased costs in a better way? Is it the seller in a sales contract, or is it the buyer? So if it is the buyer who is better able to pass on the increased costs, then we should find for a case of hardship. Let's now turn to the consequences. And I will first discuss the consequences that we most importantly find in the UNIDROIT principles, and we will discuss whether we can also have them under the CISG. The first consequence in many international instruments is a duty to renegotiate for the parties. First of all, if you look into real-life contracts, you find that in many long-term supply contracts, you have such a duty, explicit duty in the contract for the parties to renegotiate in cases of hardship. Likewise, the ICC hardship clauses 2003 as well as 2020 have a duty to renegotiate as the first consequence in case of a hardship. The same applies to UNIDROIT principles and the other international instruments that I mentioned, the principles of European contract law and the draft common frame of reference. In all these international instruments, the primary consequence of hardship is a duty to renegotiate. The same applies to some domestic legal systems, especially the French Civil Code of 2016 adopted the solution that we find in the UNIDROIT principles. Thus, the first consequence is the duty to renegotiate the contract. This duty, however, is unknown to the Uniform Commercial Code in the United States. It's also unknown to the German Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch, the Italian Codice Civile, and the Dutch Burgerlijk Wetboek. So we have two poles. Some of the, or most of the international instruments know this duty to renegotiate, whereas in many other domestic legal systems, it is unknown. And now the question is, do we have a duty to renegotiate under the CISG? Actually, Article 79, paragraph 5 CISG makes it perfectly clear that an impediment beyond the control of the obligor releases the obligor only from the duty to pay damages. There is no such duty to renegotiate the contract where that seems possible. There are lots of approaches that you can find, especially in literature, but also some in case law that that argue that there is indeed also under the CISG a duty to renegotiate. Some opine that it can be derived from Article 7.1, that it is a duty of good faith. Under others opine that there is a gap in the CISG that should be filled by relying on the UNIDROIT principles. Well, I think actually we do not need a duty to renegotiate, and therefore I think we should not introduce it into the CISG. That was also the opinion of the CISG Advisory Council. There is no duty to renegotiate. So let me now discuss why do I think that a duty to renegotiate is neither necessary nor desirable. Well, first of all, it is primarily party autonomy to decide whether they want to have a duty to renegotiate. They are free to put this into their contract. And if they opt for the ICC hardship clause, for the 2003 or now for the 2020 hardship clause, there is such a duty to renegotiate. So let it be the autonomy of the parties to decide whether they want to have such duty. If they have not inserted such a duty into their contract, I think I'm very skeptic about any duty to renegotiate, because renegotiation is based on voluntariness and trust. And if the parties do not want to renegotiate, they lost their trust in each other. And furthermore, there are no sanctions for any breach if we should have a duty to renegotiate. There is one exception, the principles of European contract law, no such a sanction, but we don't have a sanction neither in the UNIDROIT principles, sorry, nor under the ICC model clause. And I think a sanction for not renegotiating would not be desirable, as the situations are much too complex to decide whether one party rightfully rejected renegotiation or not, and trade calls for promptness and not for long discussions whether renegotiations were properly denied or not. Furthermore, I do think that a substantive duty to renegotiate is not as good as the procedural approaches we have. We do have in many legal systems a lot of procedural approaches that apply to all disputes. Like, for example, in many domestic legal systems, mediation is a prerequisite to start litigation. So during mediation, the parties can obviously renegotiate. In arbitration, we find many multi-tier dispute resolution clauses in the contracts. And judges and arbitrators facilitate settlements. So in fact, many arbitrations are settled before or right after the hearing. So we have many possibilities to renegotiate after a dispute arose. And if you look at the fact situations, in reality, there are not only procedural incentives to renegotiate, but also factual incentives to reach an agreement on an adaptation, for example, of the contract price if the market has risen. Look at the following hypothetical. If the contract price was 100 and the market has risen to 200, if the parties do not renegotiate, both parties risk 100 respectively. If a court or tribunal finds hardship, the buyer bears the risk of having to buy on the market for 200 without any compensation by the seller. If, however, no hardship is found, the seller risks to have to pay 100 if the buyer turns to the market and makes a cover purchase. So if the seller offers now to deliver not for the contract price of 100, but for 150, the buyer must mitigate its damages and contract with the seller. Otherwise, it might not claim 200 for a cover purchase if it turned to the market, denying the seller's offer to deliver for 150. Likewise, the other way around, if the buyer offers to pay 150, hardship is no longer present because now the seller only loses 50 instead of 100. So I think there is a strong incentive for both parties to renegotiate voluntarily, and there's no need for any duty to renegotiate. Let's now turn to the second remedy that we found especially for hardship, and that is adaptation by the court or by the tribunal. Primarily, again, I think it is up to party autonomy to decide whether they want to have an adaptation of their contract in cases of hardship. And indeed, if you look into long-term supply contracts, very often you will find that there should be a determination by a third party if no agreement between the parties can be achieved for adapting the contract to the new situations. Under the UNIDROIT principles and other international instruments, again, we have an explicit mentioning of the remedy of adaptation by court or tribunal if the parties cannot agree on a renegotiation of the contract. Likewise, under most domestic legal systems in Germany, France, but also in Switzerland, where clausula rebus sic stantibus is based on case law and has not been yet not entered the Code of Obligations, the the adaptation of the contract is the primary remedy if the parties cannot agree, and termination of the contract is the remedy of last resort. So whenever it is possible to adapt the contract to the new situation, then such adaptation should be made by the court or tribunal. Adaptation is not found in the Italian Codice Civile. Under the ICC hardship clause, the parties are offered 3 alternatives actually. And one of these alternatives is that if renegotiation fails, that the parties confer the power to adapt the contract to the court or to the tribunal. So again, it's up to party autonomy to decide whether they want an adaptation of their contract or not. CISG, question mark? Well, I think under, and this is not only my opinion, but also that of the CISG Advisory Council, under the CISG, under Article 79, no adaptation by the court or tribunal is possible. There has been one Japanese colleague arguing that adaptation of the contract is a general principle under Article 7, para 2 of the CISG, because we find it in the remedy of reduction of the purchase price. But I think this is a very different situation. In the case where we have a reduction of the purchase price, it's like a partial non-performance, and this is a remedy for breach of contract, and this has nothing to do with an adaptation of the contract in a case of hardship. So I think under the CISG, there is no possibility to adapt the contract. The question is it at all necessary and desirable? So we have to distinguish 2 situations. The first situation is where the contract is not yet fulfilled, and the second, where the contract, despite of hardship, has been fulfilled by one side. Let's turn to the first situation. The contract is not yet fulfilled. Very often, especially in a sales contract, the adaptation comes too late. If we have in mind the length of court proceedings in domestic legal systems, but also the length of arbitrations, including enforcement proceedings, then it might well take 5, or in domestic courts, 10 years until you know whether the contract is finally adapted to a situation that took place 10 years ago. So this really does not serve the parties' needs. It contradicts party autonomy. I think the parties, as I already mentioned, have ample possibilities to come to an agreement, and if they did not come to an agreement, the court or tribunal should not interfere with this situation and rewrite the contract for the parties. And I think it does not solve the parties' problems if they didn't come to a solution by renegotiation. Probably the relationship between the parties has already irretrievably broken down. So to bind them together with an adapted contract will not save their problem, and they will come back to the court or tribunal forever, and thus it cannot solve the problems between the parties. How is the situation if the contract has been fulfilled by one side? Well, even if we look into the commentary of the UNIDROIT principles, it seems to be clear that an adaptation of the contract that has been fulfilled should not take place in cases of hardship. I think rather it is an interpretation of the parties' behavior, whether we come to the conclusion that, for example, when we have an increase of in the market price, whether the seller adapted to this increase and delivered the goods despite the hardship situation, or whether the buyer, by the seller insisting on an adaptation of the contract price, accepted the goods and thus accepted an adaptation of the contract. So this is a mere question of contract interpretation. I do not think that we need the special remedy of hardship. And now I come to the third specific remedy that we can find for hardship: termination by the court or tribunal. Under domestic legal systems, this is the remedy of last resort. So the first remedy in case of hardship is adaptation, and the last resort remedy is termination by the court or tribunal. The same is true for the UNIDROIT principles and the other international instruments, including the 2020 ICC model clause on hardship. There also we have, I said we have three alternatives under the ICC model clause, and the third alternative is that the parties agree that the court or tribunal should be in the position to terminate the contract if they cannot agree on adapting the contract themselves. So again, I think termination by the court or tribunal should not be the adequate remedy. And this again is not only my opinion, but also the opinion of the CISG Advisory Council. And why? Termination by court or tribunal contradicts the international model systematic approach. Under the CISG, but not only under the CISG, also under the UNIDROIT principles, remedies are not done by the court or tribunal. Remedies are exercised by the parties by declaration. Thus, going back to the former situation, especially under French law, where a contract had to be terminated by a court decision, is not conform with the international modern approach to exercise remedies. That is why I think termination by court or tribunals, if the parties have not agreed that this should be the case, like under the ICC Model Clause 2020, should not be favored, neither in practice nor under the CISG. So if we come to the conclusion that neither renegotiation nor adaptation nor termination by court or tribunal are adequate remedies to deal with hardship, so what is left if we turn now to Article 79 CISG? Well, I already mentioned it. Under Article 79, Paragraph 5 CISG, it is clear that the party affected by hardship is exempted from liability in damages. It is now almost unanimously agreed that also if there is a case of impediment, so which includes impossibility and hardship, specific performance is also excluded. It would not make sense, on the one hand, to exempt the party from liability in damages, and on the other hand, allow the other party to sue for specific performance. What is always possible is avoidance, but it's not avoidance by the party aggrieved by the hardship situation. The avoidance is to be exercised by the other party. And for avoidance as a remedy to come into play, we must have a fundamental breach under Article 25 CISG. Thus, if non-delivery by the obligor because of hardship amounts to a fundamental breach, especially if time is of the essence for the buyer, then the buyer may avoid the contract. And I think this is the natural mechanism. Why should the seller avoid the contract? The seller is exempt from liability and exempt from specific performance. And now it's up, it's up to the buyer to decide how long it wants to stay with the contract and wait that the hardship situation maybe is over, until the hardship situation is over, or whether it may avoid the contract because time is of the essence and the non-delivery amounts to a fundamental breach of contract. Let me now conclude. Alongside force majeure, hardship is now acknowledged not only in many domestic laws, but also in international instruments, and is covered by Article 79 of the CISG. The prerequisites for impossibility, force majeure, and hardship are widely the same, namely an impediment beyond the control of the obligor that was not foreseeable and that was unavoidable. The remedies that we can find in the UNIDROIT principles are neither necessary nor desirable, namely the duty to renegotiate and adaptation of the contract by the court or tribunal. Termination by a court or tribunal contradicts the international approach that remedies, especially the remedy of avoidance, is to be exercised by the aggrieved party by declaration only, and it does not need a court or tribunal to terminate the contract. And this brings us to the conclusion. The situation under Article CISG is satisfactory. We have one single remedy for force majeure and hardship. We do not have to distinguish. Does the impediment lead to impossibility, force majeure, or is it only a hardship situation? Yeah, we can leave it open as long as the threshold is reached, and we do have the same remedy, exemption from liability and for damages, and exemption from specific performance. And I think these remedies under the CISG are sufficient and sufficiently clear. And with this, muchas gracias por su atención. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Schwenzer, for this very clear presentation. You answered most of the questions that were already posed by participants. This was a very illustrative presentation. We just have some short questions we would like to ask you. Paula, Al, can you formulate the first one, please?
Yes. Once again, to thank for the formidable and very clear conference. The assistant have many questions. One of them is, The possibility of invoking hardship within the framework of the 79 on the Vienna Convention can generate different opinions. In their view, is there a relationship between opinion number 7 of 2007 and opinion 20? In other words, is there a comparative basis between two opinions?
Yes, actually, already in opinion number 7, we pronounced that hardship is covered under Article 79. And now there has been a lot of discussion since opinion number 7 in the literature and also in case law. And that is why we felt prompted to clarify opinion number 7. Because in opinion number 7, we very, very briefly discussed the possible consequences. And we mentioned that it might be possible to have recourse to the UNIDROIT principles. And now we came to the conclusion that we shouldn't do so, that we should discuss hardship exclusively under Article 79, and that the remedies that we find in Article 79, exemption from liability and damages and specific performance, is enough, and we should not consider the other remedies.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I have another question because many times national judges apply uniform law, the CISG and the UNIDROIT principles in particular, to domestic cases for interpretative purposes. What specifically would they find different when they look both at the opinion number 20 and the UNIDROIT principles? What would be different in between these two documents?
Well, the first point is the starting point. The UNIDROIT principles clearly distinguish between force majeure or impossibility and hardship. You find them in different parts of the UNIDROIT principles. And although if you read the text of the two provisions, one for force majeure and the other for hardship, they are quite similar, and they are similar in themselves with Article 79 of the CISG. But what is really different are the consequences, are the remedies. And I think, and that is, if you look, I just read an article. Many people are now writing about COVID-19 and the consequences. And I read an article, and again, it was only about whether it's impossibility or hardship and what is the threshold, but it didn't discuss very much the consequences. And I think these consequences are core to the problem. And as I said, for example, I mean, the consequences that we can find in the UNIDROIT principles, they are entirely unacceptable for common law lawyers. An adaptation of the contract, rewriting the contract for the parties, is just a no-go for any common law lawyer, especially based on good faith and so forth. So I think if we really want to come to an agreement between civil law lawyers and common law lawyers, we should not go for these consequences, but rather stick with Article 79 of the CISG, and thus we can also convince common law lawyers.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor. Paula?
Yes, one assistant asked the following. Considering that many countries are prohibiting the import or export of some products and this could not be foreseeable for a party in another country, could we consider that a clause of regulatory compliance would compel the other party so that they cannot argue hardship or force majeure?
Could you please repeat your question? So,
Yes. Considering that many countries provide import or export of some products, and this could not be for sale for any party in another country, could we consider that a clause of regulatory compliance will compel the other party so that they cannot argue hardship or force majeure?
Oh, I'm afraid I don't quite understand what you mean. I mean, do you refer to the COVID-19 situation now that there has been export bans and?
Yes, and important export on some products is.
Yeah, I guess the question talks about. Yeah, the question talks about prohibition of import and export of some products.
Prohibition of export of products. Well, this is it depends. You know, it depends. If the seller itself is not able to export the goods, this is certainly a case of impediment, and probably impediment if it's in the COVID-19 situation, an impediment beyond the control. And that was also not foreseeable. If we are talking about the breakdown of supply chains, the question is, for example, we have a seller in one country, and the supplier of the seller did not supply because it was hindered by an export ban. Then the seller here, for this seller here, it would be a hardship situation. The question is, could it turn to other suppliers? Or was it excessively onerous for him to turn to other suppliers to fulfill the contract or not? So I think we really have to distinguish, and there are certainly, there have been force majeure situations, but there also have been hardship situations. And well, I think in many cases, performance of the contract was really excessively onerous for many market participants.
It depends the context. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor. There's another question from Ivan Oliva. It states the following: besides hardship and force majeure, should frustration of the purpose of a contract be considered as part of the rebus sic stantibus doctrine within the lex mercatoria? This taking into account its origin in common law and its current perception internationally.
Well, rightly, frustration of the contract is the concept developed in common law, and it covers both. I mean, we have force majeure comes from the Code Civil in France, actually. The other civil law legal systems use the term impossibility, yeah? And impossibility and hardship. And frustration of contract covers both. Subsequent impossibility and cases where the aim of the contract, those were the very famous coronation cases, where somebody rented a window to look at the coronation parade, and the king fell ill, and the coronation parade did not take place. So the person renting the window could still go there and look down to the street, but the purpose could not be fulfilled. It did not see the coronation parade. So that is frustration. That is also covers frustration of the contract. Certainly, I think it is any, and that is why the CISG is so charming. It's really great because it does not use any of these legal terms from domestic legal systems. It does not use impossibility, force majeure, hardship, frustration, impracticability. It covers everything with the term impediment that makes the performance of the contract more onerous, or makes it futile, because performance of the contract does not make any sense anymore. So everything can be brought under this term of impediment.
Thank you, Professor. I think we're getting close to the end of this fantastic gathering of today. We have a question from Geraldine Pinto. I don't know, Professor Paula, can you?
No, it's
Form?
no case.
It's why did you
okay.
consider unavoidability as a common element of force majeure and hardship? Isn't the unavoidable character of the event one of the elements that differentiates the force majeure from hardship? That is the question from Geraldine.
Well, unavoidable means, do we expect the obligor, for example, to turn to other sources? Yeah. If, like, for example, my COVID-19 example, if its supply chain has broken down, if the supplier was in China, and the Chinese supplier cannot deliver anymore. So do we expect the seller in Europe or in the United States to turn to another source, to turn to a domestic source, for example, where with higher prices? So this is a question of unavoidability, and that is also a question of the threshold. I mean, if we expect the seller to turn to a domestic source that is 3 times as expensive as the original source that the parties considered that the seller would get its supply from, then that might arise to hardship. Or in Europe, for example, the costs for transportation, even within Europe, have risen considerably. So the prices for fruits and vegetables in Germany from Spain have risen tremendously during the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, because the trucks could not bring, they brought the fruits and vegetables from Spain to Germany, but they had to go back without any goods because there was no supply anymore. So the question is this avoidable, or is it not avoidable? So this is also a question in cases of hardship of the relevant threshold. Whenever you say, well, the threshold to hardship has been reached, then it is unavoidable, this situation.
Thank you very much, Professor. And just starting to say goodbye, Paula, if you would like to make a last intervention, I don't know if a question or just
Okay,
on your party's presentation.
Thank you. Fernanda Garmino asks, are there any relevant percentage as a reference point under general contracts principle to consider a hardship exemption?
Well, it's first of all, it's up to the parties to define what they consider to be hardship. And they are well advised if they put it into their hardship clause when they consider, let's say, a rise in 100% in the price, in the market price also. But otherwise, as I said, I think there are no fixed thresholds. We have to consider different situations. We have to consider fluctuations on the market. For example, how has the market developed during the last 20 years? As I said, in the case of the steel trade, I found out, or we had an expert witness telling us that already 20 years ago, 20 or 15 years ago, the steel trade, the fluctuation was about 70% in the steel trade. So in my view, it was not unforeseeable, such a development in the steel market. So you have to consider different criteria to define the threshold in the relevant case.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. If there was,
I have a, yeah, Paula?
no, sorry, it's okay.
Okay, just a quick question, and then I'll give you a word, again, the final words, Paula. I have a question on your position of the duty of renegotiate, Professor. You know that the duty of renegotiate is establishing the UNIDROIT principles, and the last version of the UNIDROIT principles, the 2016 version, was also that changes were made so that to make it also appropriate to be applied in particularly in long-term contracts. Do you see there a difference? Because, and I'm thinking in particular now about the situation generated by COVID and the long-term investment contracts. Would you see there the duty to renegotiate as appropriate, contrary to what would be the case in sales contracts that are mostly say short terms or immediate contracts? Would you see there a difference?
Well, actually, I think it is primarily up to the parties to decide whether they want to have a duty to renegotiate. And they should write it into their contract. I think if they did not write it into their contract, it is not desirable to impose such a duty to renegotiate, because renegotiation, like negotiation, is based on voluntariness and trust. So if voluntariness or trust is lost between the parties, if the relationship has broken down, how should we impose a duty to renegotiate? What is that? This duty to renegotiate. And what happens if one party does not renegotiate? We don't have a sanction for it, you know? That is the point. And I think we shouldn't have a sanction. The principles of European contract law, they introduce such a sanction for breaching this duty to renegotiate. Under the UNIDROIT principles, there's no sanction. So it is a mere farce, such a duty without a sanction. I think parties know that they have, and sensible parties will renegotiate. And as I said, we have ample incentives in procedural law that the parties renegotiate. We have mediation as a prerequisite for litigation in many domestic legal systems. We have multi-tier dispute resolution clauses that oblige the parties to renegotiate before and mediate before they go to arbitration. And we have incentives by the arbitrators, especially in civil law legal systems, that tell the parties again to reconsider whether they want to renegotiate and to settle their dispute. So I think all this is enough. We do not need a duty to renegotiate in substantive law. It's because it's either they do it voluntarily or there is no basis for them to do it.
Okay, unfortunately, we have to end the presentation of today. I would stay here hearing you for days. It's very interesting, everything you say. Paula, would you say some final words for today?
Yes, I would like to thank Professor Moreno and Professor Ingeborg for the formidable and clear conference. It's wonderful and a clear answer too. It's a pleasure to meet Anna Sadip and CEDEP. Thank you very much for time here, for sharing their time in this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being with you, and thank you for organizing this wonderful event. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for CEDEP and CEDEP team too.
Yes, yes, and thank you very much, Professor Schwenzer. We invited Professor Schwenzer to come to Asunción this August. She couldn't come because of all this pandemic situation. Hopefully, in the future, she can perhaps come again. She was here last year.
Jose, we will renegotiate.
we had to renegotiate, and not far from Asunción is Santa Fe, where Paula lives, and there's also a very renowned university there, the Litoral of Santa Fe. So who knows in the future if you can visit us both. But what I wanted to say is that this is a magnificent way of commemorating two things. The 40th anniversary of the CISG, of course, with an event of such a regional reach. We had participants from Mexico, from Europe, from many countries, from Latin America. We have really a long list of people registered and watching this event on Facebook Live and YouTube, etc. So I think this was a wonderful forum for this commemoration on the one hand. And on the other hand, this was also a way of celebrating our 20th anniversary, the CEDEP 20th anniversary. And I thank you very much, Professor. I know this is an effort for you. This is summertime, this is your vacation time, and you are with us here today. So we really value that you are here supporting us with this event in this very special moment of our 20 years of existence. Thank you very much, and thank you, Paula, again, and all the CIDEP team. Professor.
On behalf of ASADIP, thank you very much, and Professor Moreno too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now we turn to Spanish. Carolina, cerramos el evento.
Gracias a todos por este tiempo, a la profesora Ingeborg por toda la oportunidad de conocer acerca de la opinión, y también a Lucas Castellani, que se sumó, al Ángelo Estrella Faría, a Paula Alves de ASADIP, que tenemos una vinculación casi siamesa con CEDEP. Muchas gracias a todos, y bueno, más que contarles los próximos eventos que tenemos como CEDEP en estos próximos días, nos gustaría dejarles, mañana tenemos un webinar nuevamente sobre composición de textos jurídicos, y a partir de ahí tenemos la siguiente semana otras actividades con tema de defensa de la competencia y cláusulas abusivas en los contratos. Nuevamente agradecerles a todos por este tiempo, y seguimos esperando que se informen de los próximos eventos tanto de ASADIP como de CEDEP a través de nuestras redes. Muchas gracias a todos y buenas tardes.
Gracias. Hasta luego.
Gracias a todos.